Lenin, tyrant or genius? We read the works. He predicted the year 2026. Introduction. Today, we will have a difficult conversation. A very revealing argument broke out under one of our previous issues. One viewer wrote, while reading about Lenin's works, "a great man," and another replied, "he's just a psycho. There are calls for executions on every page." And here is the main question of our video today. Which of them is right? The figure of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin still splits society. 100 years after his death, the controversy continues, and it seems that it is only getting sharper. And here's what's amazing. According to the latest opinion polls, Lenin's popularity in the country is only growing. If in 2006 its role was positively assessed by 40% of citizens, then in 2024 it is already 67%, and among people over 50, this figure reaches 74%.
How can this be explained?
Why has Lenin's popularity grown so much in recent years? Why does a person who changed the course of history evoke such opposite feelings, from admiration to hatred? Most of us know Lenin from portraits, slogans, and myths, both Soviet and anti-Soviet. But how many of us have actually read his work? How many people have looked into the original source? Today, we will conduct our own investigation. We will not rely on other people's opinions and retellings. We will open his own words, his books and articles, and test both statements together. Let's try to find out where in his works there is a deep theory and where there are calls to violence. And was he a genius, a tyrant, or maybe both at the same time? Let's get started. Chapter 1. What is the dictatorship of the proletariat? So, let's start with the most popular and perhaps most frightening term in Lenin's writings, the dictatorship of the proletariat. For most people, the word dictatorship evokes unambiguous associations: tyranny, suppression, the power of one person who does not count with anyone. But what did Lenin really mean when he used this expression? Let's turn to his own words. In 1919, in his work The Great Initiative, Lenin gave a simple and clear explanation. Listen to me. The dictatorship of the proletariat, if we translate this Latin, scientific, historical, and philosophical expression into a simpler language, means this: only a certain class, namely the urban and industrial workers, can lead the entire mass of the working and exploited in the struggle to overthrow the yoke of capital. End quote. Note that Lenin is not talking about the dictatorship of a single individual or the dictatorship of a leader or a party. He speaks of the dictatorship of the class, that is, of power in the hands of the industrial workers. For Lenin, any state is a dictatorship, only not in the usual sense, but in the scientific sense. The state, in his opinion, is always an instrument by which one class imposes its will on another. And in this sense, according to Lenin's logic, we still live in a dictatorship. Only this is the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, the owner class, the bankers and owners of large corporations. It is their interests that the state protects. Their property is protected by law. Their will is carried out by the army and police. And it doesn't matter what the form of government is called, monarchy, republic, or democracy. According to Lenin, the essence is the same. Power belongs to the owner class, the minority, and the dictatorship of the proletariat is simply a reversal of this system. This is the power of the majority, the workers and peasants, over the minority, that is, over the former exploiters. Thus, the first and most important point for Lenin is that the dictatorship of the proletariat is not the tyranny of Stalin or any other leader. It is the power of an entire class that was previously oppressed. But this raises two logical questions. How long should this dictatorship last, and what was its main goal? Is it really only in suppression? The answer to the first question may surprise you. Lenin regarded the dictatorship of the proletariat as a purely temporary measure. In his main work on this topic, The State and the Revolution, he explicitly says that it is a state of transition. Its task is to suppress the resistance of the overthrown classes and create conditions in which the very existence of classes would become impossible. As soon as classes disappear, the need for the state as an apparatus of coercion will also disappear. It must, in Engels' famous phrase, which Lenin often quoted, fall asleep or die away. But even more important is the answer to the second question. According to Lenin, the main task of this power was not to suppress it. Its main function was creative. The dictatorship of the proletariat was not needed to destroy, but to build a new society on completely different principles. Its goal was to organize millions of working people, involve them in the management of the state and economy, and teach them to be masters of their own lives. This was its fundamental novelty, and as Lenin believed, its supreme democratic. Let's draw a provocative but very clear analogy with today. We are used to thinking of our political systems as democracies, but let's ask ourselves, who is democracy for? When key economic decisions are made by the boards of directors of multinational corporations whose budgets exceed those of many countries, when laws are written under pressure from lobbyists who protect the interests of a narrow group of individuals, is this the power of the people? Lenin would call it, without hesitation, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, just in a beautiful modern wrapper. From this point of view, his idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat was an attempt to create a democracy not for the sake of form, but in essence, a democracy for the overwhelming majority. And here we come to the question that we will leave for discussion in the comments. Do you think that the majority government can do without suppressing the interests of the minority? Chapter 2. Critique of Pure Democracy. We have seen that the dictatorship of the proletariat, in Lenin's understanding, is not a tyranny but a majority power, albeit temporary. And then a logical question arises. What did not suit Lenin with the usual familiar democracy? The answer to this question is one of the most acute and relevant moments in his entire legacy. Lenin was one of the harshest critics of so-called pure democracy. In 1918, in his work, The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, he wrote a phrase that even today sounds like a challenge. Pure democracy is the false phrase of a liberal who fools the workers. Why so abruptly? Lenin believed that to talk about democracy in general, outside the class context, is to deceive people. He asked a simple question: what class is democracy for? For Lenin, any democratic republic, even the most democratic, as long as private ownership of factories, banks, and land exists in it, remains essentially a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, just in a beautiful modern wrapper. To prove this, he was not unfounded and gave specific, sensational examples at the time. Take France, the cradle of liberties. Lenin constantly referred to the Dreyfus case, the infamous trial of a Jewish officer who was accused of espionage without proof. All democratic France is split, and while the best minds, like the writer Émile Zola, defended the innocent, the whole military caste, the entire state machine, defending the honor of the uniform, went to forgeries and lies to condemn him. For Lenin, this was the clearest proof. When it comes to the interests of the ruling class, all democratic freedoms come to an end, and the apparatus of violence is used. Or look at the United States of America, a country that was considered a model of democracy. Lenin sarcastically pointed out the practice of lynch trials, brutal lynchings of the black population, which took place with the complete connivance of the democratic state. He spoke of the bloody suppression of strikes, the shooting of workers who dared to demand better working conditions. What kind of freedom is this, Lenin asked, if it exists only for the rich, and bullets and gallows are prepared for those who are trying to fight for their rights? Thus, his conclusion was inexorable. There is no such thing as pure democracy. There is democracy for the rich, which turns into violence and suppression for the poor. Freedom of the press really means freedom for the bourgeoisie to buy up newspapers and form public opinion. And equality before the law is a fiction, when one side has money for the best lawyers and the other has nothing. It was precisely this deception, this hidden dictatorship of capital under the guise of universal freedoms that Lenin sought to expose. But criticism without a suggestion is reserved for publicists, not political leaders. What did he offer in return? What mechanism was supposed to ensure real and not formal power of the people? The answer is tips. But before we talk about the Soviets, we must understand why Lenin was so dissatisfied with the main institution of bourgeois democracy, the parliament. In his work, The State and the Revolution, he gives it a scathing characterization. According to Lenin, parliamentarianism is not an instrument of the power of the people, but a special system to deceive the common people. He writes that every few years, the oppressed classes are allowed to decide which representatives of the ruling class will represent and repress them in parliament. The parliaments themselves, as he pointed out, have become talking points, the main purpose of which is to create the appearance of work, while the real state work is done behind the scenes, in chancelleries, in staffs, in ministers' cabinets. Instead of this system, Lenin proposed to rely on the organ created by the workers and soldiers during the 1905 revolution.
The Soviets of workers, soldiers, and peasants' deputies. What was their fundamental difference with the parliament? First, the Soviets were conceived not as legislative bodies, but as a working corporation. They had to simultaneously issue laws, enforce them themselves, and check their implementation. That is, they combined both legislative and executive power, eliminating the bureaucratic gap between word and deed. Secondly, it was a power that came from the bottom up. Deputies were elected not by territorial districts, but directly in factories and military units. These were people from their own background, whom everyone knew. And third, and this is perhaps the most important democratic mechanism, the right to recall a deputy. If a deputy stopped expressing the will of his or her constituents or failed to do his job, he or she could be recalled at any time and replaced with another one. And this created a constant, living control of the masses over the representatives. Let's draw an analogy with today again. How many times do we hear about lobbying when a large corporation, pharmaceutical or weapons, spends millions to convince deputies to pass the law it needs? In such a system, a deputy becomes more dependent on his sponsor than on voters, whom he will not see until the next election. The council system, with its right of immediate recall, was designed to make this impossible. Thus, for Lenin, the power of the Soviets was not the abolition of democracy, but on the contrary, its highest form, direct, effective, and controlled by the people. But to establish this new power and protect it, a clash with the old world was inevitable. And this brings us to the most complex and bloody topic of our investigation, the topic of revolutionary violence. Chapter 3. Lenin and Revolutionary Violence. And now the most controversial part. Was Lenin really an apologist for violence? Did he really call for shootings on every page, as one of our viewers claimed? First, let's look at how Lenin theoretically justified the need for revolutionary violence. And here we cannot do without his work, The State and the Revolution. For Lenin, the state is neither neutral arbiter nor a representative of the whole of society. As we've already said, for him, any state is primarily a machine for suppressing one class by another. It is an apparatus of violence that consists of the army, police, courts, and prisons, and this apparatus always serves the class that is in power. That is why, from Lenin's point of view, the change of power can never take place peacefully. He was absolutely certain that the ruling class, be it the feudal lords or the bourgeoisie, would never voluntarily give up their property and privileges. As soon as his power is threatened by a real threat, he will not hesitate to use the full power of his state apparatus to crush any resistance. And here we come to the key question that Lenin raised. Who starts the violence first? According to his theory, violence already exists in society. It is systematic and permanent. This is economic violence, when millions are forced to work in the most difficult conditions for pennies. This includes direct violence when the state suppresses strikes and demonstrations. According to Lenin, revolutionary violence is always a response to the violence of the ruling class. In The State and Revolution, referring to Marx and Engels, he writes bluntly that a proletarian revolution is impossible without the violent overthrow of bourgeois rule. But this violence is not an end in itself. This is a tool that is necessary to break the old state machine, created to oppress the majority by the minority. Listen to how he puts it. The bourgeois state, Lenin writes, cannot be replaced by the proletarian state by simply dying out. It can be destroyed by the proletariat in only a revolution. This is not cruelty for cruelty's sake. Theoretically, this is a surgical operation. Painful, bloody, but necessary to break the apparatus that has served for centuries as a tool of suppression of the majority by the minority. Thus, if we present Lenin's theory impartially, we get the following picture. Violence on the part of revolutionaries is not an act of aggression, but a forced self-defense of the oppressed class. It is a response to the violence that the ruling class will inevitably use to maintain its power. This is theory, and it is precisely this idea that underlies all the most terrible accusations against Lenin. But what did this theory look like in practice? Was violence really used only as a response? And how to separate a theory written in the quiet of an office from the brutal orders that were issued in the midst of a civil war? Let's turn to one of the most terrible and frequently cited documents, the so-called Telegram to Penza of August 11, 1918. It is in such documents, and not in philosophical works, that the answer to the question of calls for executions is found. But before we read these lines, we must, as objective researchers, reconstruct the context of that time. What was happening in the country in August 1918? A full-scale civil war is underway. The Soviet Republic is in a ring of fire of fronts. Denikin's army is advancing from the south, and Kolchak's army is advancing from the east. The country is dominated by interventionists. In the cities, especially in Moscow and Petrograd, a terrible famine begins. There is no bread. In order to save cities from extinction, the government introduces surplus procurement, the forcible withdrawal of surplus grain from farmers. In response, kulak riots break out across the country. Kulaks, that is, well-to-do peasants, often refuse to hand over grain by armed means and kill members of food detachments. At the same time, the White Terror is unfolding. White armies occupying towns and villages organize mass floggings and shootings of those who sympathized with the Bolsheviks. It was a war without rules and without mercy. It is in this situation that Lenin sends his famous telegram in response to reports of a kulak revolt in the Penza province. Here is his literal text. Comrades, the uprising of the 5 kulak powers must lead to merciless suppression. The interest of the entire revolution demands this, for now, everywhere, the last decisive battle with the kulaks is taking place. A sample should be given. First, hang them, certainly hang them, so that the people will see no less than 100 notorious kulaks, rich men, bloodsuckers. Second, publish their names. The third, take away all their bread. Fourth, assign hostages. Make sure that for hundreds of miles around, the people saw, trembled, knew, shouted, and strangled the blood-sucking kulaks. These words are terrible, and no context can justify their cruelty. But our task as researchers is not to justify, but to understand. This is not a philosophical treatise. This is not a political program. This is an order given in the midst of a disparate struggle for survival.
This is the language of war, the language of terror, which at that moment was used by all parties to the conflict. The purpose of this order is not just to punish, but to intimidate, show that any attempt to disrupt the supply of bread to starving cities will be suppressed with maximum demonstrative cruelty. And here we must clearly state the main thing. A theoretical paper written to explain the principles is one thing, and quite another is an order given in conditions of war, famine, and total bitterness. To take such orders out of context and present them as the quintessential Leninist views is either ignorance or deliberate manipulation. This does not negate the brutality of the order, but this shows that Lenin, the theorist who talks about dictatorship in the state and revolution, and Lenin, the practitioner who gives the order to hang, are figures acting in completely different circumstances. So we have sorted out the most complex and controversial topic. But Lenin was known not only as a theorist and politician, but also as an economist, and his main economic work was surprisingly prophetic. Let's move on to it. Chapter 4. Imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. We have dealt with the most pressing political issues related to Lenin, but Lenin was not only a revolutionary and a politician. His economic analysis, made more than a century ago, is still being studied in universities around the world, and many modern economists, even if they are not communists, admit that he is right. In 1916, at the height of the First World War, while in exile in Zurich, Lenin wrote his perhaps most important economic work, Imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. In it, he tries to answer the question of why free and progressive capitalism of the 19th century turned into a monster that dragged humanity into a world massacre. Lenin was not unfounded. He studied hundreds of works by bourgeois economists, statistical reports of banks and industrial unions, and on the basis of these data formulated the 5 main economic signs of imperialism. Let's analyze them clearly and in order. The first sign is the concentration of production and the creation of monopolies. Lenin noted that free competition, the main engine of early capitalism, at a certain stage leads to its opposite. Small and medium-sized enterprises go bankrupt or are absorbed by larger ones. As a result, in each key industry there are several giants, trusts, syndicates, cartels, that negotiate among themselves and actually destroy the free market. As he wrote, concentration at a certain stage of its development leads to monopoly. The second sign is the merger of banking and industrial capital and the formation of a financial oligarchy. Banks, according to Lenin's observation, ceased to be modest intermediaries. They themselves became giant monopolies which, merging with the industrial giants, formed something new, financial capital. At the top of this pyramid is a narrow group of people who control both industrial assets and huge cash flows, gaining power unthinkable for ordinary industrialists of the past. The third sign is that the export of capital becomes particularly important. If earlier countries mainly traded in goods, then under imperialism, as Lenin showed, the export of capital becomes the main thing. Monopolies are becoming cramped within their national borders. In order to make super profits, they start investing massively in other, less developed countries. Building factories, railways, and developing raw materials there is more profitable than investing money at home. The fourth sign is that international monopolistic unions of capitalists are being formed, dividing the world. The largest monopolies of different countries, having divided their domestic market, begin to divide the world market among themselves. They create international cartels that set world prices, share markets and sources of raw materials. The world ends up in the hands of several giant corporate unions. And finally, the fifth sign is that the territorial division of the earth by the major capitalist powers has been completed. The economic division of the world, which was discussed in the previous paragraph, inevitably leads to a political, more precisely to a military political division. By the beginning of the 20th century, the free, unoccupied lands ended. The entire world was divided between several great powers. And now, as Lenin wrote, only a redivision of the already divided world is possible, which means that wars for colonies, for markets, and for sources of raw materials are inevitable. For Lenin, the First World War was just such a war, for the redivision of the world. Here are the 5 characteristics that Lenin identified in 1916. This was his diagnosis of the capitalism of that time. But the most striking thing is how accurately this diagnosis describes our world today. Let's take these 5 points and just look around. The first sign is monopoly. Lenin said that the free market, where there are many small shopkeepers, inevitably eats itself up. As a result, there are still a few giants in each industry that take everything. Let's remember, before in any city there were many small private shops, but now what? Each district has 1 or 2 huge retail chains that sell everything from bread to household appliances. These giants dictate prices, decide which products will be on the shelves and which will not, and it is impossible for small stores to compete with them. This is monopoly in its simplest and most obvious form. The second sign is a financial oligarchy. Lenin wrote that banks would cease to be just savings banks. What do we see today? There are several major banks that have so much money that they own shares in almost all the main enterprises of the country, in oil companies, in steel mills, and in the same retail chains. It is as if one very rich family owned not only all the shops in the city, but also the factories that produce goods for these shops. This is the financial oligarchy that controls the entire real economy through money. The third sign is the export of capital. Here is the simplest example that anyone who has worked in a factory can understand. Why did many enterprises that used to produce clothing, shoes, or electronics in our country suddenly close down? And on the market, there were exactly the same products, but sewn or assembled somewhere in China or Vietnam. Because it is more profitable for the plant owner to close production here, where you need to pay a decent salary and taxes, and withdraw your money, your capital, to a place where labor costs a penny. This is the export of capital in action. The profit remains with the owner, and the workers are left without work. The fourth feature is international unions of capitalists. Look at any imported product that you have at home, for example, for household chemicals, washing powder, or toothpaste. Most likely, it will be produced by one of 2 or 3 giant global corporations that own dozens of different brands. These giants have long divided the entire global market among themselves. They decide which toothpaste will be sold in Russia, which in Brazil, and which in India, and at what price. The competition between them is often just an appearance for the buyer. And the fifth and most disturbing sign is the struggle for the redivision of the world. Today, it is a struggle over who will sell their gas and oil to other countries. This is a battle over whose companies will build nuclear power plants or railways in Africa or Latin America. When we hear in the news that one country has imposed sanctions on another or launched a trade war, this is the modern form of struggle for the redivision of the world. This is a struggle for markets, for resources, for economic influence, which is waged not only by armies, but also by economic methods. And now we want to ask you a question. Look at the world around you. It looks like Lenin really predicted everything more than 100 years ago. If you've watched up to this point, tell me, are there still those among you who still doubt his genius? Chapter 5. Lenin is a philosopher. Lenin is a philosopher. We are used to seeing Lenin on an armored car, on a podium, at a table signing decrees. But there was another Lenin. Lenin who spent his nights poring over the books of philosophers, trying to understand the most fundamental laws of the world's development. To understand Lenin the practitioner, it is necessary to know at least a little about Lenin the thinker. His worldview was based on a complex philosophical method, dialectics. In Soviet times, this word was worn down to holes and turned into an empty sound, but for Lenin, this was the main tool of knowledge, his algebra of revolution. What is it in simple terms? Dialectics is the teaching that the world is not static. Everything is in constant motion of development, and the source of this development is internal contradictions. Any object, any phenomenon, according to dialecticians, is not something unified and integral. It always contains opposites, which are in unity and at the same time in struggle with each other. Lenin conducted the most detailed studies of this method in his so-called philosophical notebooks. This is not a complete book, but his personal notes, marginal notes, which he kept for himself in 1914-1915, studying the works of Hegel, Aristotle, and other thinkers. And in these notebooks he gives perhaps the shortest and most succinct definition of the essence of dialectics. Listen to me. The bifurcation of the one and the recognition of its contradictory parts is the essence of dialectics. Bifurcation of the one. What does it mean? This means that to understand any process, you need to see it as two conflicting opposites. To understand what society is, one must see in it the unity and struggle of the oppressor and oppressed classes. To understand what an atom is, you need to see in it the unity and struggle of a positively charged nucleus and negatively charged electrons. Development is the result of this internal struggle. For Lenin, this was not an abstract exercise for the mind. It was practically a method of analysis. When he looked at the Russian Empire, he saw precisely this dialectical unity of opposites. On one hand, there is a brilliant aristocracy, luxurious palaces, and a fine culture. On the other, millions of illiterate peasants, poverty and disenfranchisement. On one hand, advanced factories. On the other, feudal remnants in the country. For many, it was just different aspects of life. For Lenin, dialectics were inextricably linked parts of a single whole that were in mortal combat, and he knew that this struggle couldn't last forever. Sooner or later, it had to be resolved by a leap, an explosion, that is, a revolution. Dialectics is what gave him the confidence that a revolution was inevitable, but she also told him about something else, the unity of theory and practice. Lenin was absolutely convinced that the naked theory was dead. Practice is the criterion of truth. Any idea, even the most beautiful, needs to be tested in practice, but even bare practice, not covered by theory, is blind. To act without understanding the general laws of development is to poke around like a blind kitten and doom yourself to defeat. The unity of theory and practice is his main life principle. And perhaps the most interesting thing is that Lenin himself was the living embodiment of this dialectical unity of opposites. He had completely different, seemingly incompatible features. He was a deep theorist who could spend months in libraries, and at the same time a tough, sometimes cruel practitioner who could order a firing squad. He was the man who wrote about the future free association of manufacturers, and he also created one of the most centralized and rigid government apparatus. Perhaps it is precisely in this unity and struggle of opposites in one person that the secret of his historical scale lies. He was neither a cardboard villain nor an icon. He was a living contradiction, and that is why it is so difficult to understand him, and that is why the debates about him will never subside. Conclusion. So back to the beginning. A great man versus a psycho with calls for executions. Who's right? Let's look at the facts. Was Lenin a genius? Yes. His analysis of imperialism made 100 years ago is an accurate description of today's world with its monopolies and trade wars. His critique of democracy for the rich is something that is being talked about in every kitchen today. He was a world-class thinker. Were there any calls for executions in his writings? Yes and no. In his main books, no. There is cold theory. But in his civil war orders, yes, they were. Cruel, merciless, bloody. This is a fact. So what's the truth? But the truth is that Lenin is a living contradiction. This is a man who dreamed for freedom for all, but built a dictatorship. He wrote about humanism, but justified terror. He was both a brilliant thinker and a brutal politician. That is why he is so relevant today, when the world is once again bursting at the seams, when the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. People instinctively seek answers from someone who wasn't afraid to call a spade a spade. Its growing popularity is not a love of terror. It is a request for justice. We won't tell you if he's a hero or a villain. Now you have the facts, his own words. Subscribe to be a part of the future.